Dear viewers, today we are going to talk about some fundamental aspects regarding the Earth's history, ontogeny and variation in the fossil assemblages. The present universe is believed to have been originated after a Big Bang explosion nearly 13.7 billion years back. However, the exact time and mode of its origin can only be speculated and impossible to know completely. The same goes true for the Earth, the real history of which can never be revealed due to the imperfect and incomplete stratigraphic and fossil record. Nevertheless, the remaining information is derived from the rocks is encouraging enough for the guiding us to explore some idea about the real history of Earth. Coming to the module first, the Archaean. The formative phase of Earth took place 4.6 billion years ago. At the end of the formative phase, the Earth's first real geological epoch, the Archaean, began during this long period of time, which lasted until 2.5 billion years ago. Many geologically significant events took place. Many of the first rocks were formed during this period, although some already existed 4 billion years back. These are observed in the oldest sections of the Earth. The relatively immobile cratons, substantial part of the continental plates that have been almost entirely undisturbed since the Precambrian era. Yet only a few of these old rocks survived the strong meteorite flux and the intense volcanism of the early Earth. Some minerals, not rocks, can be traced back as far as 4.2 billion years. On the Moon, the last giant impacts took place 3.9 to 3.8 billion years ago, when very large meteorite hit its front side, forming the large circular basins visible from the Earth also. At that point, 700 million years of a strong flux came to an end. The Earth and the Moon were undoubtedly hit by the same meteorite bombardments. Our planet may have been plagued by slightly heavier onslaught because of its stronger gravitational pull. The larger Earth also cooled much more slowly than the Moon, and as a result developed a strong internal convection and heavy volcanism. As our planet's surface was continuously reworked by all of these events, only a few rocks with green schist facies survived. At this time, the luminosity of the early Sun was about 25% less than today. But the Earth, though cooler, was not cold. It had an absorbing carbon dioxide atmosphere similar to that of our neighboring planets Venus and Mars. Through volcanic eruptions, large quantities of carbon dioxide and water were exhaled, which led to the first rains and the earliest lakes and oceans. It is possible that some water reached the Earth by the way of icy meteors, but it is difficult to estimate the relative significance. The emergence of the early marine life forms. About 3.8 billion years ago, first signs of primitive life began to appear. Today, we still find marine algae from that epoch incorporated in so-called stromatolitic limestones, where they appeared in the form of green-blue spherules or spherical lamellae. These first organisms developed a primitive photosynthesis producing oxygen that combined with iron of valency 2 in ferric oxide, that is Fe2O3. This insoluble form of iron created the sedimentary banded iron formations, what you call as the BIF. Today, these type of rocks, which were formed exclusively during the Archaean and early Proterozoic ages, are the richest iron resources worldwide. It contains lamellae of chert, a siliceous rock alternating with the bands of ferric oxides, which can be either hematite or limonite, that exhibit a red and blue color. Together with the production of oxygen, which was restricted to the oceans for at least 2 billion years, the amount of carbon dioxide, the main atmospheric gas, slowly decreased. This shift occurred because of the effects of the rain. The carbon dioxide was removed, washed out from the atmosphere, and combined with calcium, hydrogen and oxygen to form limestones or coal and petroleum. At the seafloors, it mixed with the mud and sediments to form carbonates. Next is the oxygen enters the atmosphere in the early Proterozoic. About 2 billion years ago, oxygen entered the atmosphere. Up to that time, the oxygen which was produced by the photosynthesis in the sea had combined with all the available iron until it reached the point at which it influenced the atmosphere and some continental rocks. Under the influence of oxygen, which then may have been only 1% of the atmospheric composition, continental red beds appeared, showing large amounts of ferric iron in the form of banded streaks. Some oxygen on the continental shelves may have given rise to the first cell structures and later to oxygen-breathing organisms. In the early Archaean, the Earth was still hotter than today. Scientists estimate that at least in the thinner lithosphere, temperatures were about 200 degrees Celsius higher. This caused a slightly different form of volcanism and produced the greenstone granulite belts and the higher grade granulite gneiss terrains, both of which are found in the all older cratons. They are considered the first major contribution to the Earth's crust. The greenstone belts appear as elongated structures, but they have to be differentiated from the orogenic belts, which appear later with the advent of plate tectonics. Greenstone belts are primarily composed of mafic, ultramafic lavas and some sediments, their green color being created by fine-grained epidote and chlorite. They stopped forming between 2 and 1 billion years ago in the mid-Proterozoic age. Even higher temperatures were needed for the origin of so-called komatiites, which are magnesium-rich rocks from very hot ultramafic lava that often contain diamonds, formed only in the Archaean. They provided valuable ores for the kimberlites of today's South Africa. It seems strange that very near to the kimberlites there are other rocks that were created in a cold environment. Apparently, there must have been a temperature difference between about 1000 and 3000 degrees Celsius at crustal depths of over 40 kilometers. This could be explained by a very narrow convection cycle in which hot material was transported upward and cold material downward. An example for high crustal temperatures is early banded gneiss of granulite facies. Metamorphosis at 600 to 700 degrees Celsius, while amphibolite facies which metamorphoses at about 5 to 600 degrees Celsius, needs only slighter lower temperatures, showing a slight chemical similarity to the Moon's Terra rocks. The Proterozoic. The Proterozoic began 2.5 billion years ago. Life was established but still on a microscopic scale. Multicellular organisms began to develop only at the very end of this epoch, around 1 billion years ago. The continuous cooling of the Earth led to the growing of a rigid outer shell composed of the crust and the uppermost mantle, that is the lithosphere. The development of plate tectonics. By the time the lithosphere had developed, rifts and mobile belts, huge shelves and large mountain chains began to form. About 1.9 billion years ago, the Escaleft mountain range developed in the northern Europe. Its shallow subduction zone is still observable today by reflection seismology. Between 1.2 and 0.9 billion years ago, a very long mountain belt stretching from the Greenvillian area in the eastern North America to the Skåne region of the southern Sweden developed. Several continents accumulated to form the supercontinent Rodinia. Thus, the motion of plate tectonics were well established. Two observations support this assumption. First, the appearance of the blue schist in the middle of the Proterozoic is notable. A blue schist can only be created in the low temperature, high pressure environment of a steep oceanic subduction zone. Fast subductions carry cold material to the greater depth and pressure. Second, the formation of the first ophiolites can be observed. Ophiolites are oceanic rocks thrown on land during a massive ocean-continent collision, and they are only found in the strong convergence zones of mobile plates. The supercontinent Rodinia lasted at least from 1 billion years to 650 million years ago. It then broke apart, but nevertheless it had lived longer than the latter Pangaea of Alfred Wegener's hypothesis. It was speculated that another supercontinent in the Proterozoic preceded Rodinia, but scientific observations are yet too vague. Another hypothesis assumes that there is a 500 million year cycle during which continents accumulate, stay together for some time and disperse again. This theory is based on the considerations of heat flow. If possibly by chance a supercontinent has been formed, heat release from the interior is hampered by the thick continental lithosphere. Heat accumulates and forms magmas that rise, creating ridges or rifts, which finally led to a spreading and dispersal of the continents. The statistics might be poor, but the physical explanation makes sense. The formation of today's atmosphere. During the Proterozoic age, the atmosphere changed dramatically. The oxygen reached the present level. Carbon dioxide was, except for a very small fraction, expelled from the atmosphere and began to generate carbonates at the bottom of the ocean and lakes. The noble gas argon increased as potassium decayed. However, the eventual dominance of oxygen producing photosynthesis and the incorporation of carbon into the carbonates at seafloor is provided our planet with its present unique atmosphere, which is so much different from the carbon dioxide atmospheres of our neighbor planets Mars and Venus. At the end of the Proterozoic, life forms had not only evolved but the hard skeletons that could have allowed us clearer fossil evidence of organisms in the epoch. However, that development came about very soon at the beginning of the Phanerozoic age, approximately 570 million years ago. But before the evolutionary burst and the diversification of life could begin, the Earth experienced a terrible cooling which transformed it a kind of a snowball. The Phanerozoic. The Phanerozoic, just before a rapid diversification of marine life began, culminating in the Cambrian explosion between 525 and 575 million years ago. An extreme glaciation occurred. The megacontinent Rodinia dispersed in the new Proterozoic around 770 million years ago and left many small continents scattered near equator. Increased rainfall in the tropics scrubbed the atmosphere, absorbing carbon dioxide out of the air, increasing erosion and reducing global temperatures. Large ice packs formed in the polar oceans and a positive feedback mechanism started. The white ice reflected more solar energy than the darker seawater, and this in turn drove temperatures even lower. Finally, the whole planet was covered by ice. Temperatures dropped to -50°C, creating an effect called as Snowball Earth, which lasted a few million years. Without rainfall, carbon dioxide expelled from volcanoes gradually accumulated. The planet warmed and the sea ice thinned. Open water was re-established in the tropics and began absorbing solar energy. This in turn created yet another feedback mechanism, this time towards global warming. A hot, wet earth washed bicarbonates and other ions into the oceans, where they formed carbonate sediments. New life forms with multicellular structure developed, and the first hard skeletons appeared after a prolonged genetic isolation. The era of the Phanerozoic. After the so-called Archaean and Proterozoic ages, there was a third age called as the Phanerozoic, which itself is divided into three eras: Paleozoic, Mesozoic and Cenozoic. The Paleozoic. The first period in the Phanerozoic is the Paleozoic, is Cambrian, that is 570 to 505 million years ago. Earth's climate was warm and there were still many small continents around the equator. At this time, an explosion of life forms with hard shells and skeletons took place. Trilobites, the forerunners of crayfish, evolved at this time. They consisted of 3 pieces and ultimately developed into 600 different species. The first, shell-like brachiopods and mollusks that are forerunners of the snails, also appeared at this time. The Ordovician period, that is between 510 and 438 million years ago, saw a great increase in volcanism. From the southern continent Gondwana, the terrains Avalonia and Armorica were rifted apart and drifted to the north. Then the Laurasia and Baltica cratons drew near to each other as Avalonia arrived from the south. Limestones and carbonates developed and the number of trilobite species decreased in conjunction with the evolution of the brachiopods and mollusks. During the Silurian period, that is 438 to 408 million years ago approximately, the collision between Laurasia, Baltica and Avalonia terrain occurred in the north. West Avalonia accreted to the Laurasia, that is Greenland and North and Northern America, mainly the Northern Appalachians, Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, while the East Avalonia docked to the Baltica, forming the Norwegian Scottish mountains. Towards the end of the Silurian, the Proto-Atlantic, called as the Iapetus Ocean, began to shrink. Many marine life forms began to move onto the land, sheltered by an ozone layer on the top of a nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere not too different from today's atmosphere. Many microorganisms on the oceanic shelf began to form layers of hydrocarbons, and some trilobites were still present. Around the same time, the first fish developed in the oceans along with reefs and corals. From examining the fossil remains of ancient corals, scientists have concluded that the tides were strong, that the moon was closer, and that it took the Earth some 410 days to orbit the Sun, and that it took the Earth some 410 days to orbit the Sun. During the Devonian period between 408 and 360 million years ago, the Caledonian Mountains developed further and the Iapetus disappeared completely. Additional terrains split apart from the approaching Gondwana continent and drifted north. In the Northern America, the massive Michigan Basin developed. The first marine mammals, radiolarians with rigid skeletons, appeared and fish diversified. On land, early forests began to fill with ferns and algae. During the Carboniferous period between 360 and 286 million years ago, an enormous mountain range, the Veriskides, formed in a collision of terrains from the south. Towards the end of the Carboniferous, rifts, grabens, and huge strike-slip faults initiated and collapsed of the mountain ranges, including the Appalachians. Only the Ural Mountains continued building. Due to the arrival of the terrains from the east, the climate was humid and warm, and layers of coal were deposited in swamps worldwide. A further diversification of land flora took place and the first conifers appeared. Then in the Permian, some 286 to 250 million years ago, the huge continent Pangaea was created, comprising nearly all the continents of the present Earth. The climate became warm and dry, large portions of polar ice began to melt, the sea level rose, and a huge transition transferred seawater onto the lowlands of the continents, which eventually resulted in the formation of land-based reservoirs of hydrocarbons based on marine microorganisms. On the western rim of the Southern America, an ocean continent collision triggered of the formation of Andes. The collapse of the Veriscan mountains continued. Flora and fauna diversified again, while a large foraminifera, a form of marine protozoans, and marine sea urchins developed. Reptiles diversified. Some even survived the great extinction that at the end of the Permian killed nearly 90% of all the life forms, including the last trilobites and early corals. The Mesozoic, the Triassic 250 to 206 million years ago, was the first period of the oncoming Mesozoic. The supercontinent Pangaea was still intact and slowly moving northward, and the climate became humid and warm again. Continental rifts and strong volcanism developed, heralding the eventual breakup of Pangaea. As mentioned, the huge extinction at the end of the Paleozoic eliminated all but 10% of the then living species. However, new species were able to exploit the vacant niches, and by the end of the Triassic, the first birds and gliding or possibly even flying reptiles had appeared. They diversified, some developing into the first dinosaurs. Various shells, the horsetail plant, and more forms of the conifers also appeared at this time. During the Jurassic between 206 and 144 million years ago, Pangaea began dividing. In the south, the Atlantic opened, soon followed by an opening in the Caribbean. The large Tethys Ocean south of the Europe emerged, dividing Africa from the northern continents. In South America, the Andes continued to grow. Large shelf areas developed, providing good conditions for the development of the spineless ammonites, which eventually split into some 8,000 species and are used to characterize certain locations and geological sections also. Marine transgressions created more hydrocarbons in the flooded lowlands. The terrestrial flora began to resemble today's species. Conifers changed again, and the first real bird, the Archaeopteryx, emerged. A well-preserved Archaeopteryx skeleton was found in the shales of Solnhofen, Germany. Flying dinosaurs appeared, as did the crocodiles, the latter in a form similar to the today's. During the Cretaceous period, that is 144 to 65 million years ago, a strong seafloor spreading caused a significant increase in the area of Atlantic Ocean. In the Western Pacific, a kind of megaplume created numerous volcanic spots. As a result, large amounts of carbon dioxide entered the atmosphere, causing a greenhouse effect. In this time period, the early and middle Cretaceous temperature and carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere reached a maximum. The polar ice caps melted and the sea level rose, leading to another geological transition worldwide. At the same time, many oil and gas containing layers were created out of marine microorganisms and plankton. Toward the end of the Cretaceous and into the Mesozoic, the Rocky Mountains and the Alps began to form. The climate deteriorated again, it got colder, ice caps formed, and many animals suffered from the lower temperatures, which decreased the food supply. Oaks, willows, and other trees of the present appeared, plants with pollens, real insects, and warm-blooded animals were present. Many of the new mammals and the last of the dinosaurs may have completed with each other. The Cenozoic. At the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, the second great extinction of the Phanerozoic took place, triggered by the impact of a huge meteorite. Flooding, darkness, a fall in the sea level, and cooling conditions predicted today for a hypothetical nuclear winter, where the consequences the northern Atlantic and other northern oceans developed. Australia separated from Antarctica between 60 and 45 million years ago. India collided with Asia, triggering the formation of the Himalayas. At the same time, the Hawaiian chain bent as the whole Pacific plate changed direction. In the middle of the Tertiary, early horses, pigs, giraffes, camels, and the first primates appeared, but most were smaller than today's species. Between 5 and 6 million years ago, the earliest evidences of hominids begin to appear in Africa's archaeological record. In Australia, which was now isolated, marsupials developed. Antarctica was isolated too and began drifting towards the South Pole. The low temperatures around the South Pole decreased even more through a marine circular current around Antarctica, where all land animals were doomed to perish. The world climate deteriorated and polar glaciers became more frequent, making rapid advances. The Quaternary with the Pleistocene about 1.6 million to 10,000 years ago, and the subsequently following Holocene were the time of human evolution in Africa. During the last ice age, possibly as early as 30,000 years ago, humans reached the America via a land connection between Siberia and Alaska. A great climatic change occurred at the beginning of the Holocene, as long as ice age evolved into a warm climate. This warming up seems to have been convected and connected with a worldwide change of ocean currents, but why the ocean currents changed is by no means clear. In the long term, the accretion of India to Asia and later the amalgamation of South and North America blocked worldwide east-west currents in the lower latitudes, and this could have been the major cause. On the other hand, minor changes in the seawater temperature might have initiated a big change in the ocean circulation, a so-called self-amplifying process, a process that is also not well understood. The evolutionary history of life, or ontogeny, in terms of biological development, perhaps the most critical revolution in the environment of the young Earth was those that allowed for the formation of fluid water. There are many views regarding dawn of the primitive life on Earth, including the idea that it was first formed in a warm period or ocean, and even extraterrestrial origin is also believed based on the presence of amino acids in the structure of comets and traces of bacteria inferred from the analysis of ALH 84001 meteorite from Mars. Whatever caused the origin of the first primitive organisms, they needed shelter from the harsh ultraviolet radiation from the sun. These early life forms also required light or thermal energy to develop photosynthesis in order to produce sugar and oxygen out of carbon dioxide. These conditions are found in water at a depth of 5 to 15 meters. But they also appear to be present in deep hydrothermal vents. Whether lightning on the surface of Earth helped to form complex oceanic or organic molecules as found in some classical experiments. In addition, scientists still don't know how the first proteins with large chains of amino acids formed. However, one assumes that the crystal growth of certain minerals in clays, sulfides or iron supported the first critical self-replication. This ability to replicate is considered the beginning of life. Accidental errors during the copying of the genetic information cause variation and mutations. The selection of most able organisms under the given environment, Darwin's idea of the natural selection, finally organizes the tree of life. Although life on Earth started rather early, it was restricted to the microscopic organisms for about 3 billion years. In our understanding, life is a stable chemical system with the capacity to evolve with the help of 3 components: reproduction, mutation and selection. It took an enormous amounts of time from 4 to 1 billion years ago for the first multicellular life forms to evolve. In the beginning, life had not yet developed the genetic DNA code, but used RNA chains which can initiate certain replications between 3 and 4 billion years ago. Some organisms developed a shelter or membrane, resulting in a structure that can be regarded as the first cell. Out of this, a 3-part family tree developed based on the bacteria, archaea with a 1 cell only, and eukaryotes, a cell with membrane and a few chromosomes. The last group eventually developed multiple cell systems, which in turn led to the evolution of animals and humans. Even the simplest organisms had already developed the chemical and biological conditions for self-replication and a DNA code. The use of the same building blocks and structure for the DNA from the most primitive bacteria helped up to multicellular animals and humans supports the assumption that life started by chance at a particular time in one location. It is possible that there were another competitors, but a selection of the DNA structure and replication started early and became global. Coming to the multicellular life, some organisms with more cells have been sporadically observed in the early Proterozoic around 2 billion years ago. Between 1 and 1.3 billion years ago, a sexual revolution began by mixing genes of two different individuals as opposed to the self-replication. Organisms had more chances for the mutation and selection. Some biologists call this the first explosion of life, but life still remained microscopic. The real explosion occurred at the beginning of the Cambrian after the Snowball Earth had turned into a hothouse. To study the development of hominids, we jump to the Tertiary period about 65 to 1.6 million years ago. Starting approximately 60 million years ago, a massive diversification of mammals began. About 50 million years ago, ape-like animals began to appear in the paleontological and archaeological record. These early primates divided into gibbons around 22 million years ago, orangutans about 17 million years ago, gorillas about 10 million years ago, and chimpanzees about 7 million years ago. Between 7 and 5 million years ago, some species became bipedal, walking almost fully upright. Based on some fragmentary fossils, the oldest known hominid is Ardipithecus ramidus, which first appeared about 4.4 million years ago. In Ethiopia's Afar region, several remnants of Homo afarensis have been found that are nearly 4 million years old. Most surprising is the fast development of the human brain, which started to increase in size about 2 million years ago, and within the 2 million years had become 3 times larger. Some scientists assume a hardware-software feedback system also, including the development of language and larynx. According to this hypothesis, the hardware, including the brain and its complex cerebral cortex, enlarged and diversified rapidly because its function was continuously challenged by sensory impulses from the peripheral nervous system. This in turn caused complex learning and thinking the software to progress. A strong positive feedback loop had to be led to a steady enhancement of both the hardware and the software. It is interesting that in the development of the hominids, several parallel lines similar to those of many animal species are also found. The most recent parallel development is that of the Homo neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens, beginning about 100,000 years ago. They seem to have lived nearly side by side for at least 70,000 years. Neanderthals had a different head shape and shorter larynx, although they excelled as skillful tool makers. Their language capacity was probably limited. It was the development of a refined language, a capacity closely connected with a complete and abstract thinking that most likely gave Homo sapiens a certain advantage. Whether the two species interbred or what other cause might have induced the disappearance of the Neanderthals is still a matter of debate. Thank you very much.